welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where two friends get together and talk about the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and joining me today is my co-creator, Amir Nakui. I love doing these ones, just me and you hanging out.
Super cash.
Super cash, just sipping on our beverages.
Don't go there, because I'm about to throw you under the bus.
All right. I am drinking creamer and water right now.
Cold water and creamer.
It's not important. It doesn't make me a serial killer.
It might.
All right.
That, along with mint chocolate chip ice cream, is like, it's good. Apparently we have a lot of serial killers in here.
A lot of serial killers in the studio today. You know what, that's actually kind of suitable because we're gonna be talking about a theme of which there are many serial killers that fall under this umbrella, although hopefully none in the studio today. We're gonna be talking about angels of death. And this was a topic that Amir and I had sort of bounced back and forth talking about. We just sort of kept coming back to the nomer, an angel of death. What does that mean? What is it about? Who are people that fit into this category? Who are people that maybe we think fit into this category and we umbrella term this, but they actually should not be in there? Yeah. So we've picked 3 different individuals who have been called angels of death from different time periods, different countries, and we're gonna just discuss what they did. And then in part 2, we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk about the reception of what they did, maybe their motivations, their rationalizations, were these mercy killings, and also their sentencing, because the sentencing varies between these 3 people so much that I think it's worth talking about what the justice system thought of their crimes. Now, before we get into that, we have a video package that is narrated by Mary Ignatova, who we've worked with. She was the DP on the Red Rover shoot, and just a great, awesome editor, and she's been on Murder with Friends before. So Mary, let's talk about what we are gonna be talking about today.
There is a bold cruelty to those that abuse their positions as caregivers for evil. And yet, those that do join a wide assortment of medical professionals turned executioners. We call them angels of death. The actual angel of death was named Azrael. Translated from Hebrew, it means the one whom God helps. Perhaps it's only fitting that these individuals had a serious God complex. A quick search for angels of death will send you down a rabbit hole of names, dates, motives, countries, sentences, methods, and countless victims. Charles Cullen, a New Jersey nurse, killed at least 30 patients to prevent hospitals from dehumanizing them. Miyuki Ishikawa served only 8 years despite being responsible for the death of 103 children. And Jolly Jane Toppan liked to lay next to her victims as they died. She killed 31 people. Stories that are centuries apart, from different corners of the world, forever linked as angels of death. Today on Murder with Friends.
So those are the 3 people that we're gonna be discussing today, and there's a whole lot more to get into. So let's just break down these stories. Let's start with Charles Cullen, or is there someone that you wanted to start off with?
No, that's good, we can work our way backwards.
Okay, we're gonna work our way backwards. Charles Cullen was a nurse in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania, and he operated for 16 years as a nurse while killing people. He was active for 16 years between 9 different hospitals. He was caught in 2003, but he was able to move about pretty freely, and he's accused of about 40 murders that he has confessed to. Initially, he just confessed to 1, but investigators think that he might be linked to up to 400 murders. That's not confirmed, but
which would make him the deadliest serial killer in American history.
The most prolific serial killer in American history. But it's hard to know, and I did a little bit of research into this book that's been written about him called The Good Nurse, and the author has spent 8 years writing it, and he sat down with Charles Cullen, and even he has said that there are sort of corners of Cullen's mind that he can't get to. So we'll probably never know the truth, but what we do know is that he operated using the tools that he had on hand at these hospitals. Now, he killed a lot of people by using digoxin, which is a therapeutic medication that is for heart conditions. But then he also, there was one account that I read that was really scary, that he would just spike saline bags, just indiscriminately, just spike,
contaminate them with whatever,
with insulin.
And insulin, epinephrine,
with like all this crazy stuff. So that's how he was killing his victims. And I think we're gonna have to get into how he was able to get away with this in part 2 with regards to like what was the cover up, the reception, how we look at caregivers, people that pledge to do no harm. But I wanna talk a little bit about some things that I've read about Charles Cullen that I talked to you, Amir, days prior when I was doing my research that just shook me the hell up.
Yeah.
For example, he was very abusive to his family dogs. And when his wife at the time would say, hey, you need to stop like putting the dogs in trash bags, putting the dogs in the basement and torturing them, injecting the dogs with stuff allegedly, he then turned his attention to the neighbor's dog, and the neighbor's dog was then found poisoned. And then other weird things about Charles Cullen that, I mean, they might mean nothing. I'm sure people can do that.
He was practicing.
Well, what I'm talking about is when he would cut the faces out of photographs.
Right.
That's such a weird factoid that I found about him, and that his wife called the authorities for a domestic, dispute, I guess, and said, my husband's acting very strangely. They came over, okay, what's he doing? Well, he's harming our family dogs, and he's cutting out the faces from photographs, and he's drinking really heavily, and he also has a history of mental illness and mental instability. And the authorities were like, that's just kind of weird. That's not, I mean, which is true, that's totally true, but it's sort of behaviors like that when you know that there is something more depraved and darker going on, you look to those early things or those things he was doing that were concurrent to these murders. That's like, wow, you had something really twisted going on in your head.
Yeah.
And then let's talk a little bit about Cullen's suicide and his attempts. And
he had a really troubled childhood, just in general. His father was 58 years old when he was conceived, and he died when he was only 7 months old. So like that right off the bat, I know that there's studies out there that say older fathers like can lead to a lot of different mental issues for kids. And so he didn't grow up he grew up without a father, and by the age of 9 years old, he had attempted his first suicide.
Yeah, and
by trying to consume chemicals from a chemistry set.
Yeah, he drank a whole chemistry set.
That's insane.
Well, and this was one of many attempts at suicide throughout his life.
I tried to look up information about childhood suicide attempts, and it's hard to find really anything because children don't typically like have those kinds of thoughts about life and death like that. Like, so you must be really, really messed up.
Yeah, and it's weird that then he would find his way into the medical profession, having been so interested, fascinated, morbidly so, in death from such an early age. He served some time in the military, and while he was on a submarine, he says that a chaplain had noticed that he'd taken an interest in caring for patients at the sick bay, and that maybe he would be interested in going into the nursing field, the medical profession, and that's how he got his interest in working in that field. And he really took an interest to injecting patients in the sick bay and seeing how it would affect their body, good, bad, all that stuff. Then there's one really creepy account, and I've only seen this in one place, but I'll toss it out there and maybe you guys can see if it's been corroborated from another source. It's that at one point in time, there was another shipmate of his on this submarine that heard sort of a strange noise at some part of the ship, and they went and they found Cullen dressed up in surgeon scrubs, rocking back and forth. And then when this person said, hey, what are you doing? Cullen didn't really offer much of a response, and then I guess that was the end of that situation. But it is strange, should this account be true, because it shows that there is definitely an obsession, a very intense curiosity with the power that working in medicine wields. What does that look like on someone, like having a surgeon's scrubs on and wanting to wield that power? We're gonna talk a lot about sort of God complexes and what that does to someone, what that indicates to someone in part 2. But I think that's sort of where we'll leave it with Charles Cullen. The next person that we will go back to is between 1944 and 1948, Miyuki Ishikawa killed upwards of 100 babies. I mean,
possibly more. That's like the common thread with all of these killers is like you can never know exactly how many they did, but most authorities think that it was more than the number that they actually put down.
Yeah, and her method of killing has been really difficult for Amir and I to discern. I would be interested to see what you guys find.
Lack of information.
There's there's a major lack of information. Her death is still, her death date is still unknown. It hasn't been specified when exactly she died. Now, some people have speculated, but we don't know specifics on that. Apparently, she killed these kids through neglect.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. So just to kind of like paint a picture, this was in the period between 1910 and 1940s when this mainly happened. So Japan had like the people that she was dealing with were very impoverished, and they couldn't necessarily afford to take care of these children to begin with in the maternity wards. So she decided that the answer to this would just to kill a certain percentage of children that came through her ward.
And she would profit off of it as well.
Yeah, and eventually she realized like I can be making money off of this, so I'm gonna ask these parents quite aggressively to give me money, because it's gonna cost less for me to do what I'm doing than it would for them to raise these children as their own.
Yeah, and she had accomplices as well. Her husband was an accomplice, and then there was also a doctor that worked with her to falsify death certificates at the time. And then she only actually ended up serving 4 years, which even though she was sentenced to 8, her accomplices were sentenced to, I think, 4. They served about 2. It's very interesting. I want to get into the whys of that in part 2, but basically she was a maternity nurse who killed over 100 babies that we know of.
Yeah, and the people that worked with her were just totally disgusted by what she was doing, and a lot of them ended up quitting.
Right, so she had accomplices, but there were also plenty of people that found her behavior abhorrent and her actions absolutely awful.
But like the interesting thing, I'm sure we'll talk about it in the next segment, is just the way society viewed these things, and it's reflected by how she was sentenced, was, yeah, this is mainly the parents' fault for letting this happen. They didn't really like place a lot of blame on her for her actions.
Yeah, I mean,
it's crazy
where blame falls and how the justice system can rationalize certain things.
And it actually led to a debate about abortion and how it should be legal.
A major one.
Yeah.
Yeah, because also Ishikawa was not the only person that was engaging in these types of killings of children. There were also 2 specifically that come up when you look up Miyuki Ishikawa. There are 2 other names that will come up that killed 20 to 40 other kids at the same time.
Right, so she wasn't the first person.
She was not the first person to do this, to view this as some sort of a solution. And then we're gonna go back to 1895 to 1901, talking about Jolly Jane Toppan, who is somewhat of a folk legend, which is a whole thing I want to talk about in this next part. But she was a nurse as well, and she was a nurse with a jolly disposition who was known, Jolly Jane. Her name was not actually Jolly Jane, but when she was adopted, it was Honora Kelly. And then when she was adopted by a family to serve as their indentured servant, she was given the name Jane. Something sort of a random fact that I think is really interesting is that they hid her Irish heritage, the family that adopted her, even though there were no official adoption papers that she was their indentured servant. They hid her Irish heritage because it was really not cool
the time
to be Irish at that time. So they were like, she's Italian, which I think is just important, just sort of to offer historical context. It's something I like talking about on this show, that at one point in time, if you were Irish, that was like, that was not the thing to be.
Gangs of New York time, when the Irish immigrants were pouring in, and there was just a lot of racism and hate.
So much racism, and people are always going to find like a different, people to other and discriminate against, and we super did that with the Irish. So she was apparently of Italian heritage, but really she was Irish. Her background is kind of murky, and it makes me think about mental illness, especially since she would be given a lenient sentence due to having been found insane at the time, which I definitely want to talk more about. The legend goes that her father went crazy and was known as like Crack Kelly, something like Kelly the Crack.
Like a crackpot.
Yeah, and he was a seamster, and he sewed his eyelids shut and was just absolutely crazy, and that's why she and her siblings had to be put up for adoption.
Legends from back then are even scarier than just the urban legends you hear from now. Like just thinking of like a like a 19th century man sewing his eyelids shut because he was a seamstress. That's terrifying.
Yeah, and
that's the recipe for a horror movie.
Yeah, it is a recipe for a horror movie, and it also speaks to sort of the mental conditioning.
Give me the crack.
It's crazy.
Coming at you.
Also, what we have to deal with Jolly Jane is that there's a bit of a combination between folklore and legend, and also what we can substantiate through public record. And there are photos of her, and you can look up facts that we can confirm about her life. But over time, this all went down in like 1895. You will find that it all becomes sort of mixed together. So whether or not he actually sewed his eyelids shut, or if he just went crazy and like started poking himself, you don't know. But it sure makes for a good story.
There's a lot of similarities between her and Charles Cullen in that they both found a fascination with injecting different chemicals and drugs into their victims and seeing like the reactions that would take place.
Yeah, and seeing how it would affect different people. She confessed to killing about 31 people, but she has also said that in her confession that she potentially would have wanted to kill even more, and that it gave her this rush. Apparently there was some sort of a sexual rush to it as well, which I think people find very fascinating, especially when we talk about female serial killers, that they would kill out of a sexual desire.
You mainly find that in male killers, right?
Right,
so
a
like
sexual
hearing
gratification.
This as from a female killer is it's interesting.
Yeah, and then she would be found guilty, but also found insane, and so she would spend the rest of her life until she died in 1938, which is not that long ago when you think about it, in an insane asylum in her 80s. And so that's what these three people have done. They all got the nickname at some point in time, the Angel of Death. It's kind of strange to look back at newspaper clippings and see Jolly Jane referred to as an Angel of Death, and then you fast forward to like 2003, 2004, and you're seeing the same headlines about Charles Cullen. So in part two, we're gonna connect the dots. We're gonna be talking about the motivations, the sentencing, the rationalizations, and we're gonna be breaking down even more about these angels of death. So stay with us, we'll see you in part two.